戦闘モード起動。おはようございます。
A few weeks ago, entirely coincidentally to the fact I was working on this video, someone posed a question on my Discord. What are my favorite kinds of sports games? And it's an interesting question that I ended up kind of landing on the fact that I like sports games that completely divorce themselves from the sport ball they're connected to, while straddling the line enough to actually still be a sports game, you know? And that's not a smug way of me saying I don't like sport ball. I mean, I don't like sport ball. I was forced to play sport ball for many years as a child and I hated every moment of it, but sports just don't really connect with me on any meaningful way. More importantly though, I think that if you can adhere to being something while working under the confines of trying to be anything but that, you can do some interesting stuff. So I think the idea of a sports game that has to kind of be a sport but be anything but the sport kind of makes it one of the most interesting sports games out there. But then the question is, what are the best completely weird sports games that still try and kind of be the sport that they are? I mean, one of the earliest examples I could think of is Ninja Golfin on the Atari 7800, which to me is probably the best Atari 7800 game, but I'm also not very well versed on that console. The Genesis, of course, had those awesome Mutant League games, which were basically that sport but with violence, and yeah, violence makes sports far more interesting, I'll tell you that much. If you had a great deal of taste, you might say, what the golfin'? Because that game is amazing, and every single hole just make you say, what? While still kinda sorta being a golfin' game. I think one of note that doesn't quite adhere to these rules would be something along the lines of Ninja Baseball Batman, because that was a game that basically just used sports as a delivery vector for an aesthetic. It was ultimately just a beat 'em up. A very good one, and if you have any chance, you should play it because it's actually a really good beat 'em up, and it's sad it's never been remade in any way. But let's stay on the topic of baseball, because I happened to find a baseball game on Steam while scouring the weird corners of things not in the English language, and I think I may have found the single weirdest sports game ever that is still actually kind of a sports game. This is... oh gosh. Well, throwing this into Google Translate anyway, it seems to think it's実録パワフル野球拳スラッガー山田, or the real story of powerful baseball fist slugger Yamada, a title I'm worried won't fit in a YouTube title, so I have no idea what I'm gonna title this video, but it is probably the single weirdest sports game I have ever played. And it's still kind of a sports game. That's the real mind-blowing thing about it. And the best thing of all, this game costs $1. It is absolutely worth it as a hidden gem that just does something completely random and different. The story to this thing is, entirely in Japanese. I did take a translation app to a little bit of the story, and it seemed like a bunch of weird non sequiturs that was really just mostly point A to B dialogue, just telling you, hey, you unlocked a new thing, while two PNGs undulate at you. So there really isn't much of a plot here, but it's in Japanese, so it probably won't affect you if you're not fluent. So I'm gonna clean this up and try and give you something a little bit better. In a world where baseball is outlawed and monsters roam the streets, outlawing any baseball-related activities whatsoever, one dragon girl must save the day, using a bat that's so powerful Ichiban Kazuga himself would blush, but also using it as a pitching machine gun thing sometimes. She must defeat all of the monsters and the robots and save the future for future baseballering generations. Or something. If I was trying to describe whatever this game was called, it would be Dynasty Warriors meets EDF meets baseball meets Surprise Shark! Because sometimes there's a surprise shark. The weird thing about this game is, while it starts off initially pretty much as a pure action experience, if you actually sit here and figure out how it works, it's actually sort of more a baseball puzzle game as delivered by an action game, and that's pretty interesting, honestly. I think this is a really neat game. So, you have a character that sort of runs around in every stage. She has a set period of time before she needs to get to the end, and she has a lot of targets and enemies in the way. By destroying enemies and targets, various barriers will fall down, thus giving her access to the end of the stage. However, it's a lot more complicated than that because you are on a time limit, and you're on a fractal time limit. Like I said, this game is a baseball game, and it adheres to baseball rules, sort of. So each stage has 9 innings. Each inning is a set period of time, and when that inning is up, you swap from hitting to pitching. In the hitting mode, it's basically Dynasty Warriors. You've got your big bat and you're smacking things, and once their health goes down to 0, you send them over the horizon. At this point, you can actually aim where you send them, which means that all of your enemies, as well as projectiles being thrown at you, get turned into your own projectiles in a sort of ranged attack. This is an important feature to know because this will allow you to take out enemies way off in the horizon, and sometimes you need to do that because sometimes enemies will hit you from the other side of the map. When you swap to the pitching mode, your giant holy bat of destiny turns into a gun that fires baseballs, and suddenly it becomes an EDF third-person shooter. This allows you to take out enemies at a distance, although bear in mind your attacks do have sort of a lobbing arc, which actually makes it a little bit tricky to start aiming with until you get super used to it. But you can also use this to take out targets at a distance instead of simply having to smack enemies around to send them into the targets at a distance once they're dead. Unfortunately, there are some strengths and weaknesses to both modes. The key weakness to the batting mode is of course the fact that you need to rely on very heavy timing or very weak enemies in order to actually take enemies at a distance, and the pitching mode has a problem with getting swarmed at close range. So you frequently kind of have to figure out how each stage kind of wants you to approach it, because if you swap between modes at exactly the wrong time, you could die very quickly. However, that's kind of how I think of this as a bit of a puzzle game. Like, each stage feels like it's designed with a specific moment to be in batting mode and a specific time to be in pitching mode, and sort of knowing exactly how to take advantage of each area and each mode in each specific time in order to get through each stage with the highest score as quickly as possible. It's definitely an arcadey challenge game, but I think it works really well. Every single stage has a bonus objective that you need to complete, and doing that does something. I'm not really sure what actually, but each and every challenge is relatively simple. You usually get to the end with X number of health or Y number of points or within a certain amount of speed. They're not terribly complicated, though it might take 1 or 2 attempts to actually complete these objectives. And you get ranked depending on how well you do each individual level. As you complete stages, you'll unlock sort of experience points for Yamada, and you can reinvest that into her by giving her new stats. Stuff like having more health, more attack, more defense, longer inning time. These are not huge improvements, but they do feel like you are making your character functionally better as time goes on. You can even get her different jerseys that change her stats up and her character model, which is pretty cool, even if it's just a slight palette swap more than anything. A more meaningful change that happens as you play through the game is that you do unlock more mechanics as you play through. And these are actually big changes. Stuff like being able to swap out innings whenever you want, as opposed to when the innings timer ends. You're still limited to 9, so you probably shouldn't be swapping them all william-nilliam, but if there's a point in a level where you just feel like the other mode would be more beneficial, you can swap on the fly now. You can unlock a super move that makes you a lot more glamorous and stylish. You can even unlock collectible baseball cards that have an in-game effect. Unfortunately, these baseball cards are one of the few things that I don't care much for in this game. For one thing, they're pretty much the only part of this game that requires you to understand Japanese or have a translation app handy, and they seem to be randomized through basically in-game gacha using a made-up currency you can only earn in-game. Now, I appreciate that I don't have to spend money on this nonsense, but less randomness, please. But these cards are effectively active stat buffs that take place in the game, but they end up being far more effort than they're worth. For one thing, you have to know what they say. Having taken a translation app to some of the cards I did have on hand at the time, you can have up to 6 cards equipped at any one time. However, it seems like 2 slots are relegated to being possibly equipment. You can forego them not being equipment, but equipment gives you passive bonuses, whereas everything else is an active affair that you have to manually trigger, so you probably want that equipment just for the constant buffs that they'll provide you. And one of the slots seems to be kind of sorta reserved for a stronger ability than the rest, like super rare cards that have more effects than everything else. The thing is, you can kind of forego this for the more common active cards as well, but I'm not sure why you would. The problem, however, is of course figuring out exactly what each card does, as well as knowing exactly when to use it in a level, which kind of overcomplicates the whole thing. That's sort of the problem with this still being an import and all these features being acted. In order to use these cards, you have to actively open up a separate menu that's just for the cards mid-combat, which pauses the game, and then go through and figure out what card you want to do, and it just stops the flow of gameplay entirely just for a buff. I'm not a big fan of that. The only other thing I immediately dislike about this game, honestly, and you should be able to see it right now, is the GUI is just a mess. There is so much text in so many different corners of this UI that it's really just distracting more than anything. And it's not just that I can't read it actively. I mean, sure, that's a problem, but in action games, you generally want to focus on the action and not read a bunch of stuff to the side of the screen, because once again, that kind of just distracts from the flow of gameplay itself. And in this case, more critically, it could get you killed, just because it's a distraction, and that's bad. And that sucks, because otherwise this is a really interesting, engaging game. It's a 3D action game, 3D shooter that's also kind of a sports game where you're running around attacking random post-apocalyptic nonsense trying to get a high score. It's goofy and irreverent, and it's fun, and it knows it. And it's kind of the embodiment of that sort of classic concept of just wacky Japan. You know, this feels like just random nonsense that's incomprehensible, but at the same time super enjoyable. The overall presentation to whatever this game was called is okay. Visually, it doesn't look all that impressive. And don't get me wrong, this game is definitely a budget title, but everything kind of works in its own sort of weird collage of nonsense, all just sort of being thrown at you at once. Audio-wise, I don't think it's all that memorable or anything. The soundtrack itself is varied in the different types of songs it has, and they have a decent pacing to them, but a lot of them just sound far too mellow. And I'm not saying this game absolutely needed death metal or something to make this substantially better for the fact that you're fighting robots and monsters and sharks out of nowhere in the apocalypse with baseball weaponry, but it couldn't have hurt. On that note, though, there is one really rockin' shamisen track on this soundtrack that is awesome, and sometimes it just feels like the tone doesn't quite fit the gameplay, you know? That said, it feels like their focus was far more on the voice clips and sound effects and just monster grunts and stuff, because it does tend to drown out the music a lot, which is kind of a shame because it's more distracting than anything, but I'm sure you could probably find some setting to change that. But I recorded with just the default settings to give the most accurate depiction of what this game was like, and in that case, the monsters and voices are just a little too loud in gameplay to drown the music out. At one point, I fought a random attack helicopter that was blaring Ride of the Valkyries, because this game gets it, but for the most part, the sound design is not terribly all that memorable. Overall, the presentation itself is kind of that of a budget game, but that's what it is. It knows what it is, and it's more than happy to sort of lean into that. Now, if you want a copy of I can't remember what the title of this game is, and I'm going to put a link here because it's entirely in Japanese and I'm not retranslating it again, it's on Steam for $1. And going into this, I kind of thought that this was just going to be a cheap, weird Unity game. But the thing is, even the cheap, weird Unity games on Steam can cost an absurd amount of money. I've seen cheap Unity asset flips for 20, 30, 40, 50, sometimes several hundred. Those games usually don't have any sort of gameplay worth talking about. They don't have any sort of intelligent thought behind it. It doesn't have any sort of soul. This is the antithesis of that. First of all, it's a budget game that costs a budget price of $1. That alone makes it worthwhile. This is a game that is happy to sort of celebrate the fact that it's a budget game. It's happy to say, yeah, we're gonna be a dumb, goofy, irreverent thing that's more silly than anything. It reminds me, honestly, a lot of EDF like that. You know, a game that was designed to be very, very budget, very, very weird, very, very cheese, and ultimately, because it was comfortable being itself and it was willing to celebrate what it was instead of what it wasn't, it was something that was genuinely full of heart. This game has a lot of really interesting design choices. The fact that it is still more or less a baseball game just shown through the window of a post-apocalyptic EDF Dynasty Warriors mashup is brilliant. The gameplay feels very, very well thought out, and it is $1. The strange, irreverent, goofy, wacky Japanese-ness of this game in this budget package is so good compared to games I have paid substantially more for. Heck, I have played games that are, you know, actual full releases that cost over $100 at this point that I have spent less time with than this. This game cost me $1, and I would say it's easily a hidden gem on Steam. Its name may be incomprehensible, but its gameplay is kind of remarkable.
緊急下げ警報。直ちにシェルターに退避してください。グエイ